What's up, skeptics? Welcome to another episode of Reason to Doubt, your source for all things skeptical. I'm Jordan, and I am joined with some special guests today. We have Grayson and Dr. Zach. So, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for
Thanks,
having us.
thanks for having us.
Today, we're going to be talking about we thought we'd lighten it up. You know, we've talked about the Shrouded Turin, we talked about some really dense stuff. So, we thought we'd talk about something fun and hip. In this case, scientific racism, otherwise just known as racism for race realism. As we were talking behind stage before we started, the sad thing about this is because, you know, we live in America, it's always relevant. Whenever you're going to talk about it, it's always relevant. But it is an important issue because, unfortunately, people use the trappings of science to further their own racist ideologies. And this specific ideology tries to say that the races, whether people are black or white or whatever label that we use, that those have biological realities attached to them. So they are real things that you could actually measure. And that's not true. So we're going to talk about that and all the evidence for it. So before we get into that, though, you're both new to the channel. So why don't we spend a little bit of time introducing yourselves to the audience and why they should care what you have to say. So, Zach, why don't you go first?
Yeah, my name's Zach Hancock. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I specialize in population genetics. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Michigan. We do a lot of statistical modeling. My background is mostly crustacean systematics and molecular evolution, but I got into a lot more theory here recently. I run a YouTube channel at Talk Pop Gen, where we do a little bit of evolution education, some pseudoscience debunking, as well as a little bit of history and philosophy of science.
Awesome. It's a great channel. And the links to both of these creators' contents will be in the description and maybe in a card if I remember to put it up wherever it is. So, be sure to check that out. Grayson, how about you?
Yeah, so my name is Grayson. I run the YouTube channel Based Theory, which is essentially devoted to debating and debunking pseudoscience such as race realism or climate change denial, creationism, and flat earthers. There's a lot of pseudoscience that I engage with on my channel. So if any of that sounds interesting, check it out. I also just generally put out some spatterings of videos that are celebrating different topics in science and history. I'm a huge trivia geek, so I love learning new things. That's one of my favorite parts of debating this, is that confronting this pseudoscience kind of forces you to learn about real science and real topics in genetics and biology pertinent to this subject. So I have a love of learning. I have an undergrad in biochemistry, so nothing approaching the kind of educational bona fides as my fellow guests here, but still, I definitely have a big passion for science and learning. So it's all in good fun until it's not, and you end up figuring out just who these pseudoscientists really are and what they really think and how dangerous that they can be and how frightening it is that, hey, it's on the rise in our society. It's not declining, it's becoming more relevant in the political cultural sphere. And that is not what I had on my bingo card for the 21st century. So hopefully we can help put a pin in it and show scientifically why it's a bunch of nonsense hokum tonight.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point that a lot of people who maybe live in privileged positions might not be aware of just how prevalent racism is. But if there's one good thing that has come out of the cultural zeitgeist of the last few years, it's that racism has been full frontal display for everybody to see. So there's no questioning it. But hey, now that we know it's there, not that we didn't already know that, but in case you aren't aware, it's there. Now we can address it. And I think what's important about this topic specifically is that people who might be turned off by the more blatant forms of racism, the more the more visceral sorts of racist talking points, might not see these talking points that we're about to go into that way at first.
Mm.
And so it potentially could take in people because it has the trappings of science, right? And so people who don't know any better, who aren't familiar with the topic, might be taken in by these ideologies and end up, in a bad place. So that's what we're going to prevent today. But before we get into that, why don't we describe what is racism, race realism actually, and what is race if it's not real?
Yeah.
Like, what is it actually?
Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe we should, yeah, definitely begin with talking about the distinction of race and what race actually is. And there's two different ways that we can define race. We can define race socially, and that's sort of the way we really think about race, right? Whenever you're filling out a little survey and you're putting down, I'm Caucasian, I'm African, I'm Amerindian, like whatever little thing that you're filling out, that's just like sort of our social conception of what race is. And this is something that I want to stress in the very beginning is super real, right? Because it represents your culture, it represents your identity, it represents the way society perceives you, which could be different depending on what society you were raised in. For example, like what is white and black in the United States is different than what is white and black in Brazil, right? Like so, there's these different conceptions of race depending on where you're at, but those conceptions and those experiences that you feel based on the race that you are designated as socially is a very real thing. So I want to start off by clarifying that the social concept of race is real. It's real in the way that money is real, right? That it's not a physical entity, but it is something that will affect your life, right? Because we agree socially that it's real. The other conception of race is really what we're going to be talking about today. And this conception of race is what is not real. And that is that there's actually something biological and natural to those same social conceptions of race. That there is something either genetic or phenotypic or physiological or intellectual or mental, like there's some other thing that the biology is being reflected in our social conceptions, right? And that is really what race realism is talking about, that this social concept is not just a social construct, but is actually a real thing.
Yeah. The
So
only thing that I would add to that is just, I guess, generally speaking, I would consider race as a way of classifying people into subcategories based on, like, basically certain phenotypic features, but not other phenotypic features. Like, skin color is a broadly speaking one, but again, there are some races that have similar skin tones, and then they're subclassified based on different facial features or something. Like, there's an Asian race versus a Caucasian race. And they
Mhm.
might have similar looking skin tones, but they're still classified under this race realism pseudoscience as being different races. So I would broadly consider it to be a way of categorizing people based on basically arbitrary phenotypic features.
Yeah,
Because you don't see different races of brown haired people versus black haired people versus gingers. Like, we don't typically have races of hair colors or eye colors or other arbitrary traits. Um, like, there's no widow's peak race. Again,
yeah,
but these are all just arbitrary
but
phenotypic
don't
features.
give him any ideas, Grayson.
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh,
So
I'm sorry. Yeah, but and the other thing I was going to say was just considering the way that race and racial perceptions evolves over time, and just like the history of this concept of race. Like, back in when you had, city states in Greece or Mesopotamia, a race realist might consider all those people to be the same race. But at the time, in that cultural milieu, there was obviously no conception of race. It was different city states had different identities, and that was how they classified and sorted people. So this concept
mhm.
of race actually emerges as a concept in human history and was constructed societally, not so much as being inherent biologically or naturally, which we would see this concept of race, if it really was inherent biologically, reflected throughout all of history, instead of being a concept that clearly was developed in a certain period of history.
Well, let me push back on that a little bit. I agree with everything you said, but as a good host, I have to articulate the other side. So, couldn't it be that this phenomena has already always been real, but we only recently, or whatever recently is, we can talk about the history. Only recently became aware of it. So there was always this biological race, but the ancient Greeks didn't know about it. But we, as the enlightened modern people, do.
Yeah,
I'm
I
going to
think.
pass this one to the geneticist. I think that they might have something to say on this question.
Yeah, so I think we need to think about this a little bit taxonomically. So we need to think about the way the word race has been used in systematics and in taxonomy and what it means in that context. We don't often use race anymore because of the historical baggage, but classically what it meant is something akin to subspecies, right? It was something close to like sort of geographic varieties of subspecies. So if we sort of take this out of the human component for just a second, and let's think about subspecies of gophers. Okay, so let's say there's 10 subspecies of some gopher. And these 10 subspecies are designated typically phenotypically, like they have something about them that is unique to each one of those subspecies, but not shared between any other. If we think about this genetically, what we're really talking, and evolutionarily, we're talking about all of these subspecies are expected to be monophyletic, reciprocally monophyletic. So all the members within one subspecies are more related to one another than they are to any other subspecies. Right? That's the way you can discretize these sort of taxonomic units and make them something quote unquote real. There needs to be boundaries and discrete breaks between them. And that's how race has been used taxonomically, at least since the early 1900s, when we started having conceptions of bringing in evolutionary ideas and phylogenetic ideas with taxonomy, right? And so for a race to be something real, to be something biological, we need to be able to actually draw distinct boundaries between races such that they are reciprocally monophyletic with one another. And so to me, for something to have taxonomic meaning, that's where we have to start. And so to get to your question, we need to ask that very important question, right? Are humans actually showing this sort of monophyletic patterns across socially designated races? That's the big question.
So speaking up for the idiots in the crowd, phylogeny, that's like the things you could look at and see, like the outer appearances that are manifesting from underlying genetic or whatever sort of factors leading to that. That's the thing you could look with your eyeballs and see a difference.
So yeah,
Right?
so with phylogeny, what we mean is just simply the pattern of relatedness, right? So if I took a bunch of genes of some let's say the subspecies of gophers, subspecies 1 and subspecies 2, I took a bunch of individuals in each of those subspecies, and then I reconstructed their family tree. Who's more related to who? All the ones in the first one should be more related to each other than all the ones in the second one, and then eventually they share an ancestor somewhere in the past, right? Now, if that's true, then we can say these are discrete units, right? That everybody within them are more related than they are between. And that's what a race concept or race realism concept would expect that sort of thing to occur in nature if humans really
So
have discrete races.
Your phenotype is basically what
sorry,
you
that's
like.
what it
What is
was. That's what
what
I
the
was thinking.
appearance is? Like
Yeah,
brown hair, like handsome features. These are my phenotype.
yeah.
See, I knew that. I was just making sure you guys were listening. That's and so basically, it's kind of like your own family tree, where I'm more related to my grandmother than I am to somebody else's grandmother across the planet.
Exactly.
Uh, but we are both more related to each other than either of us are to a cat, for
Yeah,
example.
exactly. Yeah.
I'm not sure
So,
if this is totally derailing or not, but this is a concept that sort of touches when you're talking about relatedness to your grandmother versus a grandmother on the other side of the world. Something that I think could potentially be seen as a concept that if a racist could grasp it, could potentially help to offset their racism, is something called a genetic isopoint or an identical ancestry point. Where you're talking about, you are still maybe not related to a grandmother on the other side of the world, but you still do have ancestral relationships with people in other continents. Like people sometimes get a too narrow a view of ancestry, but when you go far enough back in time, eventually you reach something called this identical ancestry point, where at a certain point in the past, I think it's estimated to only be like a few thousand years ago. And no, young Earth creationists, that does not mean what you want it to mean. But like, 4 to 8, 9,000 years ago, there's a certain point in the past where every single person that was alive at that point in history that had descendants to the modern day is your ancestor. The only difference between my family tree and somebody else's is that those ancestors are represented by a different number of positions in your family tree, because your ancestors start repeating on family trees when you go far enough back, because there's just not enough humans for you to be able to construct the tree. There's not enough humans alive at that point. So you have repeats. And so that you reach a certain point when every single person on earth today has the same overall set of ancestors. They're just represented at different proportions in your family tree, but all the actual ancestors are the same. Even like you and somebody in an uncontacted tribe in the Amazon, once you reach this global identical ancestry point, you have the same sets of ancestors. Like the human species is, it's not, there's not a bunch of different subspecies. I'm sure we'll get to that, but we really
Yeah.
are one species. There's always been this kind of crosstalk between human populations.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I want to clarify it with just a tiny bit of math. And so, if we think about your pedigree, right? So your pedigree doubles every generation backwards in time, right? So you have two parents, you have four grandparents, you have eight great grandparents, 16 great great grandparents, right? And so it's doubling in the past. Eventually, what's going to and there's another thing that's happening is that every one of your ancestors are moving away from your birth position, right? So you have this sort of cloud of ancestry that's growing both in number of individuals and it's spreading across space, right? Because your ancestors lived in a different part than you do. And the further back in your pedigree you go, the further away from you they lived. And you're also getting more of them because it's doubling every generation back. Well, eventually, this doubling process equals the total number of individuals alive on the planet at that time, right? You've got so many individuals in your pedigree that it encompasses the whole human population. When that happens, that's the identical ancestor point. Everybody alive during that time is the ancestor of every present individual alive today. They're part of that pedigree. So that's how that process works. So you've got this dual process of the pedigree is growing backwards in time, but you're also spreading out across space backwards in time because humans disperse across a landscape. And so your ancestors are the whole population, and hence they lived everywhere on the planet. Only between 5 and 8,000 years ago, the pedigree encompasses the entire planet.
And I think that if like more racists understood that concept, maybe they would, potentially leave these pseudoscientific beliefs of theirs behind. Because I just know that these racists are, when they think of their ancestors, they're probably thinking of like a Viking, basically. Like they're not thinking of their ancestors thousands of years ago. They stop at a certain point and they stop identifying with people in the past after this point where they just think is really cool, like Vikings. Everybody thinks Vikings are cool, but you can trace your ancestry beyond, 900 AD or whatever. You can keep going back. And what you find is that your ancestors are more and more distributed across the entire planet and shared with more and more of humanity until, yeah, you get the point where we all have the same ancestors and you can no longer, I think it just helps because I think these racists are very obsessed by their idea of their pristine ancestors, their heritage, their past. And I think that that's just a cultural hangup that when you actually get down to the real science, it's not true. It falls apart.
Well, okay, so let's clearly lay out the two different ideas so we can compare the two moving forward. On the one hand, you've got the idea of mainstream science where we're all one species with some genetic variation, but we're basically very highly related to each other with no way you can draw clean lines between any one group and any other group, right? And the race realist view, where while we may have shared an ancestor in the distant past, just as we can have different species, we can share a common ancestor with cats, but we are not cats. We They would say I, as a white man, probably can share a distant ancestor with a black man, but we are not the same species or we're different subspecies because they think there's been enough variation so they're insert whatever suite of positive traits they'd like to imagine they have.
Mm.
So now, with that all in, uh, what what are the pieces of evidence that indicate that they're wrong? Right? So
Yeah.
how can we prove that they are incorrect?
Yeah, so based on just the way that you laid it out there, and based on the way we're thinking about sort of this taxonomic distinction of subspecies, that would have to imply that all Europeans are more related to one another and all Africans are more related to one another, and they form this distinct two clades, right? But this is not what we see. We have known that this is not the way the human phylogeny looks for at least 20 years at this point. All Europeans are actually nestled within a clade of Africans. And what this means is that there are some Africans that are more related to Europeans than they are to other Africans. And there are Europeans more related to Africans than they are to other Europeans. There's also Europeans more related to Asians than they are to other Europeans and vice versa. And so like these discrete categories completely fall apart when you actually put them into the context of the phylogeny. And all of this makes sense if we understand out of Africa, right? That all human populations originated in Africa and spread out. This means that there was a phylogeny that was existing, lineages that existed in Africa. A subset of them migrated out. which means that whatever they were most closely related to when they migrated out, they are still most closely related to, right? And so like all the non-African individuals nestle within the clade of Africa. So all the variation, all that genetic variation that they talk about is actually a subset of the genetic variation that exists in Africa. And a great example of this is like lactose tolerance, right? In that there is only like one or two alleles that Europeans possess that convey lactase persistence into adulthood. But those same two alleles are just a subset of 6 to 10 alleles that exist in Ethiopia and Sudan to this day among milk drinking peoples, right? So we just have a tiny subset of the already existing variation that permitted that trait. And this is true for many of the other traits that exist as well.
I also like pointing out the example of like Aboriginal Australians or Melanesians, because I'll often, when I come across race realists on like Discord or something, I want to ask them like, would you consider Aboriginal Australians to be black? And they say, yeah, of course. And then you say, well,
I mean,
okay,
look at
but
them. Yeah.
yeah, I know. You could just look at them. They have dark skin, so they're black. But then again, with out of Africa, all populations outside of Africa are going to be more closely related to each other than certain populations in Africa. So again, this doesn't make any sense because we'd be more similar to Aboriginal Australians as Europeans or Asians or North Americans or whatever. We'd be more similar genetically than other groups within Africa because the out of Africa dispersions were done by the ancestors of Aboriginals and Europeans and Asians and Native Americans, etc. So again, like whenever you probe this concept of race and you ask them questions about, okay, well, who's in it, who's out of it, and does that have any kind of genetic or biological basis, their whole conception starts to break down, and they either start moving the goalposts and say, okay, well then fine, then Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians, they're their own race. And then they start making these new arbitrary categorizations just so they can preserve this idea that, race must be real, no matter how many different arbitrary categories of race I have to come up to preserve that notion.
So, yeah, it seems like if you were sufficiently motivated and sufficiently willing to contort the definition of species enough, to the point you could draw, because it's just a name we came up with that we have ascribed meaning to, right? So if you wanted to draw a little species box around every single human being, you could do that. But at that point, it's like got no meaning or value, right?
Mhm.
So if it's going to mean
I,
anything like what species actually mean,
I think if we use the same methodology that we use to categorize species and subspecies within the rest of the animal world, and we apply that to humans, we very quickly see that humans don't have subspecies.
Yeah.
If we're using the same consistent
right?
methodology, if you want to do special pleading and all of a sudden make arbitrary subspecies of humans, I mean, that basically is what race realism is. So,
Yeah, and to be clear, we do use the same methodologies across organisms, right? So we use this like to designate population structure and to find out whether groups are monophyletic, whether they should have subspecies designations. We don't call them races because again, we don't really use that in biology anymore. But it's the same idea. It's the same methodologies have been applied to humans, and were applied to humans first, right? Like we've always been more interested in ourselves because we're humans. It's just the way we are. And so we've been applying these same methodologies to ourselves. If you look at us versus chimpanzees, there are discrete subspecies in chimpanzees that are like quite diverged from each other, right? And so like that categorization works well for them. But when you apply that same methodology to us, it falls apart. There is no discrete structure that you can find. We are one continuous population.
So, if that's the case, why is it that there are apparently stark differences based on the geographical location of populations? I mean, if you just pluck a random person out of the center of Africa and pluck a random person out of Norway, they're going to look to they're going to have very clear differences in appearance. So why is that if they're actually so related?
So this is a really important point, and I get into this argument a lot because there's some confusion about what we mean when we say like social races and like geographic variation. We are not saying that there isn't variation in humans and that humans don't have genetic variation across the globe. We absolutely do. We don't disperse across the entire globe in our lifetime. That means that in every single village, every single family, every single local pair that you can grab are on average more related to each other than they are to some random sample from elsewhere. And so you get these correlations between geography and ancestry. This is exactly what we see in every other organism and what you might would expect to see. The question is not whether there is geographic variation, which we all accept. The question is whether or not, one, that it can predict social races the way we understand race socially, and whether or not that variation is discretely partitioned across space. Whenever, if you were to plot that same genetic variation as a function of just distance, so take some individual in the center of Africa and then just have a continuous line of individuals going all the way to the Americas, and then plot the genetic difference across there is no discrete break. It is a continuous line of differentiation across that break. Now, if there were true races, what you would expect to find is you would get to a certain point, that what we call isolation by distance. It's just geographic distance. And then there's a break that happens where it leaps off of that linear line and it's suddenly higher than what you would expect to see. When there are true subspecies, that's the exact pattern that you find. And that's what we look for to say, okay, there's a discrete break between the two. You never see that in humans. It's a simple linear relationship between genetic isolation and geographic distance, exactly what you would expect if an individual only moves so far in their lifetime.
And
Yeah,
it seems
generally
like
speaking, both phenotypic and genomic differences between groups of humans are largely a function of geography,
Mhm.
not a function of any categorization of race. Like Zach was saying, it's a smooth variation with distance. It depends on certain geographical features, like how much the sun is shining is one of the biggest factors in your skin color. Like these are just like any other organisms, functions of the environment.
so it seems like in order for you to have that speciation, there needs to be a separation so that they're not mingling their genes anymore, right?
Mhm.
That's part of like a necessary condition. And so it seems like what you're saying is the evidence is such that humans left Africa, right? They went and spread, but there was never this stark like line. Okay, you're out of Africa. Therefore, no one who left shall ever return or talk or mate with anyone like along the way, right?
This,
And so,
yeah, this is a really important point, and it's a constant point of confusion among people. They think that there was like a single event out of Africa and nobody ever came back. Right? It's just like they just walked out and then that was it. It was like we're done with it. Right? No, that's not how it happened at all. And in fact, the more African genomes that we've gotten, the more we've actually seen that like Neanderthal alleles are appearing in lots of African populations as well. They're at a lot lower frequency because they're not the source of the original admixture event. But what that is evidence of is that people came back, right? So you had this constant back and forth across this strait. There was never just like a complete secession of gene flow. And if there had been, we would see a lot more differentiation than what we see.
so
Can we just talk about Neanderthals for a second? Because this is one trend that I have seen that is just baffling in race realists. I
Hmm.
have seen multiple of them try to build up Neanderthals as some sort of Übermensch,
Yeah.
some sort of more perfect being of human. And they're like, because, they have this conception that uh, one differentiator for European genomes is that they have higher amounts of Neanderthal DNA. So they think, oh, well, Europeans are the superior race. So therefore, if the difference is more Neanderthal DNA, then the Neanderthals, then they build them up like some sort of like Aryan ideal of like human, like just amazing humans. And this is just so funny to me because like for decades and decades, Neanderthal has kind of been like synonymous with like a dumb caveman, like a
right.
luddite, and they're trying to build this up, and it's just so funny to me that they will literally latch on to essentially anything just to try to preserve this notion that just doesn't have a basis in biological reality, even so far as to idolize Neanderthals as their superiors. And I've seen, a few young Earth creationists even going so far as to say, like, Adam and Eve were probably more Neanderthal-like than we are. And I'm like, you're literally doing biblical revisionism and making Adam and Eve like Neanderthals or Homo erectus. Like, this is just look in the mirror. Look what you're doing. Like, at some
Yeah.
point, you have to stop. And say, does this make sense?
Yeah, we should also be clear that the one of the ways that we found out about Neanderthal introgression is that we looked for that the regions in which Neanderthal alleles exist are actually in regions that have high rates of recombination and they have low selective constraint. And you do not find Neanderthal alleles in functional regions of the genome. And what this is
So
a
what
very
does that mean? That phrase you just said, what does that actually mean?
which yeah, let me break it down.
The recombination.
Yeah,
Put
yeah,
it in.
yeah. Sorry.
Pretend we're not
Okay,
biologists and
sorry.
put it
Yeah.
in.
So if you can imagine just like humans and Neanderthals hybridize and create hybrid offspring, what you expect in the first generation is half of your genes are come from the human ancestry, half come from Neanderthal ancestry, right? And then based on succeeding generations, you can have recombination events, right? That then begin to move those onto the same background through time. Now, what will happen is if you get a Neanderthal allele into a functional part of the human genome, selection appears to get rid of it, which suggests that it's actually maladapted to the human genetic background. So over time, what you only find are Neanderthal alleles in regions where recombination, where the swapping is really high, which tends to suggest that selection is really weak there. In regions like protein coding genes, you don't get much recombination. Recombination is suppressed in protein coding genes because you can break up alleles that you want to keep together, right? So what that all of that is indication of is actually Neanderthal introgression was harmful and that the hybrids probably had reduced viability. And so what we have actually seen over time since we introgressed with them is actually selective purging of Neanderthal alleles. So it's been always very interesting to me when white supremacists bring up Neanderthals as this sort of thing that, oh, this is what differentiates the Europeans. It's like, well, selection certainly doesn't seem to think so. It is trying to get rid of that Neanderthal ancestry. And also, of course, it doesn't actually group Europeans as distinct because we do have the more African individuals we sequence, and we should make a clear point here that Africa is grossly under sequenced, right? Like if you compare the number of sequences we have from Europe, we have hundreds of thousands of sequences from Europe. We have a fraction of that from Africa. The bulk of the genetic diversity is in Africa, right? And so we are missing tons and tons of human genetic diversity because we just for decades we have not prioritized sequencing Africa. But now when we are trying to get more African samples, what we are finding is, oh, lo and behold, they also have Neanderthal alleles. They're just at much lower frequency because they're a secondary introgression from people that have come back, right? Um,
And that bit about missing African genomic data is like cannot be understated
yeah.
of how big of a deal it is. Like every time you see these studies that are misappropriated by race realists to try to push some sort of racist narrative, I mean, every time they're doing some sort of comparison to like African genomes, like
Mhm.
this is the huge glaring omission that causes their results to be taken with such a huge grain of salt. Like you can't even take a lot of it very seriously. And
Yeah.
one more point on the Neanderthals before we move on. I just think it's funny also whenever I see white supremacists bring up this point about Neanderthals, like there are other populations that also have really high amounts of Neanderthal genomes that are not Neanderthal DNA that are not European, like in I think Southeast Asia. Like,
Mhm.
and they're then when the race realist is confronted with this, they're all of a sudden not going to say, "Oh, well, that means that the Southeast Asians are the real Übermensch." No, they'll just have to do another mental backflip and try to make more bins or more racial subcategories or move the goalposts more.
Yeah.
It's just one big futile like preservation of their ideas on a sinking ship.
So okay, so Mr. Scientist, you got your fancy genome and you plot it over distance and it's a continuous line and whatever. But if that's the case, you've seen the test scores for like IQ and all this sort of stuff. How come they match on to my preconceived notion for race, huh? Not mine, obviously, but like, so I mean, we've all seen those graphs where it's
Mhm.
like IQ distribution and Europe and America are deep blue because we're super smart, and and Africa is not because obviously we're white people are better. So what's going on with those kind of plots?
Yeah.
So
So
really quick,
yeah.
Zach is about to give a really good scientific answer, but really quick, I just wanted to sum this up in like 3 words. Correlation does not equal. Dang, 4 words. Correlation. Dang. Okay, I am not counting. Correlation does not equal causation. However many words that is, that you could sum it all up in that essentially. Zach, take it away from me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's a good point, and always a good thing to bear in mind, especially when we're thinking about genetic sequences in general. Actually, is there's a whole conversation to be had under like what we call genome-wide association studies, where you're linking particular genetic variants with traits, especially if those traits are things like socioeconomic traits, like IQ, intelligence, educational attainment. This correlation does not equal causation is really important, and it comes up a lot in those sorts of conversations. Um, why do we see differences in IQ? So IQ is one of those things that has sort of, in recent years, has definitely fallen out of favor as a measure of intelligence in the first place, because there has been just a slew of studies that have found that if you want to know what a person's IQ is, just ask who their parents were. Ask what their parents did for a living. How much money did they make? What's their socioeconomic background? You don't need to know anything about that person. You don't need to know their genes. You don't need, in many cases, you don't need to know their race. You don't need to know anything about them. How educated were their parents? And that is the best predictor of IQ. And so throughout the world, if you want to make a prediction about IQ, you want to make a prediction about how well someone is going to score on any given test, you just need to know what their socioeconomic background was. And so if we want to find out why there's a correlation between IQ scores and different like nationalities, ask how wealthy the countries are, right? How much money do they have? What's been the historical influences of things like colonialism, right? Like what are the sort of impacts that have driven the mean economic or the median income of a household in that country, right? Those are the sorts of things that are going to predict IQ scores. And before I end there, I want to point out that many of the IQ scores are taken by a couple of subsets of studies that have long been questioned as being as not having good methodologies and as being really, really suspect in the way in which they collected those IQ scores. Richard Lynn is the one that's sort of most famous for this. He created one of the largest IQ databases. And he selectively picked people that were illiterate in the countries that he went to when he wanted them to score poorly on IQ scores. So like he handpicked the families that he was going to test to create a database that sort of justified what he was looking for in the first place. He's like a famous white supremacist that people cite all the time for these IQ studies, and his studies have and any paper that has published under like using his IQ data has either been retracted or it is in the process of being retracted. And there's like a whole group of people that write to these journals from the 70s and 80s and are like, look, you need to retract these papers because we long have known that these are bunk studies. So the key here is like, don't trust IQ scores in the first place. They don't actually tell you anything about intelligence. They tell you about socioeconomic status. And be sure you check where those IQ scores are coming from in the first place. There's a really good chance that they're coming from suspect studies that most of the scientific community don't even recognize as being real and legitimate studies.
That's a
As
great point.
Stephen Hawking said, people who brag about their IQ are losers.
That's a great point, though, about like Richard Lynn and these different studies. There was like a slew of these researchers from
Mm-hmm.
various backgrounds: psychologists, political analysts, like statisticians. There was like a slew of these research studies in like the late 20th century. I'm like Charles Murray
Yeah.
capitalized on some of them in his
The,
famous
the
book, The
bell
Bell.
curve. Yeah.
Yeah, there were all of these little pseudo intellectuals at the end of the 20th century that were publishing on some of this stuff. And I feel like that's really a lot of their work has only recently become really popularized. Like the bell curve was popular, but a lot of like the smaller studies, like they're picked on by race realists in the 21st century and upheld it as saying like, oh well, this kind of study would never get published today because like, oh, insert woke
That's woke.
scary
Yeah.
man here. And there's about like back in the day, back at the end of the 20th century, before woke ideology, this was real science back then. And then they want to try to say, okay, all these methodological errors, that's all just woke. Correlation does not equal causation is too woke. But like honestly though, so many of these studies are literally just, and it's like absurd that scientists would be making this error because it seems so rudimentary that unless you have some hardcore biases coming in, it doesn't seem like you would make such an elementary error here. But correlation does not equal causation. And the reason it doesn't is because there are often confounding variables that are the true causative agents here that are not accounted for in the study. So, like, I'm thinking of particular, Zach, you mentioned that oftentimes, there's a correlation between like the wealthy, like the wealth of a country and its IQ scores.
Yeah.
And there, I think Brand, I think, was a researcher that like published a study on this, and he was positing, well, obviously IQ scores are driving
Yeah.
GDP. So
Right.
he's just trying to come up with this as saying this correlation of, oh, well, if you give me a country's IQ score, I can predict its GDP. And
Hmm.
so therefore it's IQ that is causing
Yeah.
the GDP of a country. And it's just like, how can you make such a fundamental error unless you're just so blinded by your own little personal bias of racism, essentially?
Yeah, at the very least, he's flipped the dependent and independent variables there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can go all the way back to like the early statisticians, and like I don't want to let scientists off the hook here, and because we're kind of responsible for this. I want to be real clear that like a lot of this sort of, especially like the early statistics that we're looking at things like brain case size, and we're trying to like look for correlations between IQ, and like fitness. So if we think back to like people like Francis Galton, right, who famously wrote the book Hereditary Genius. He coined the term eugenics. He was a cousin of Darwin, and in many respects, well, a lot of modern statistics and a lot of modern evolutionary theory come from Francis Galton. Like the concept of regression to the mean comes from Francis Galton, right? And so, like, these people who were developing modern statistics, R.A. Fisher, Carl Pearson, Udny Yule, Francis Galton, these were the statisticians, and they were all eugenicists. And they all believed in racial superiority, right? And so just because you have a good understanding of statistics, and like, even if you're like a great scientist in every other respects, if you have a really, really strong internal bias that you are superior to everyone around you, then you're going to find what you want. You're going to make the argument that causation or that correlation equals causation, right? And we've seen this happen again and again and again in the scientific community. And it's why we always have to be willing and ready to like call people out whenever they start making these kinds of claims. Because scientists are humans just like everyone else, and we can make mistakes too. And this is why we need the peer review process to catch us in this sort of thing, and not let our ideologies drive our science or drive our politics as it did in the eugenics case.
That's a great segue to talking about how mainstream science is abused to support the pseudoscience. But before we depart this segment, I just wanted to sum up what we've done so far to kind of debunk this idea. So you talked about how the prediction of uh, mainstream science is that we'd have a continuous curve of genetic diversity as it relates to geography. It's just people spread out, and
Yeah.
so they're mating with the people close to them who are mating with people close to them, and so it's a continuous curve. Whereas if race realists were correct, you could draw distinct and not subjective boxes around different populations.
Yeah.
And instead of that graph being a continuous curve, like a color spectrum,
Hmm.
you'd see a curve and then a jump
Yeah.
in a stark step change in diversity, and that is not what we
Yeah,
see.
and this is not something that we just made up in our heads. We see this in other organisms. We use this exact kind of thing to designate discrete populations and subspecies and tons of other organisms. And so we're just applying that same methodology to humans, and it's failing.
And when it comes to the IQ thing, some other factors, there's a lot of confounding factors. For example, I always look back to the Planet of the Apes. If you remember when they're giving him the test to see if he's intelligent,
Mm.
and they ask him, I forget the question, but it's like, so, well, who was the religious founder this time? And he's like, I don't know. It's like, see, he's not a thinking animal. It's like, well,
Right,
they designed the test poorly,
right.
right? And so, likewise, IQ tests, if that you have to at least allow the possibility
Yeah.
that there could be some kind of bias there, and that is more likely the
There
case
are
given what
huge
we
cultural biases in a lot of different IQ tests, even like nonverbal ones that people try to design to be free of bias. Even those are going to have cultural biases based on people's familiarity with different concepts. So yeah,
Right.
it's almost impossible to make an IQ test that you could be universally used to all the cultures on Earth. It doesn't, it's not feasible.
For example, imagine you had a in one of those tests where they had to like, here's a laid out 3D shape. Now roll it back up, right? And like which shape
Mhm.
course that like, oh, there you go, there's a good measure. Well, if that shape is kind of like a die that people in America use all the time and have seen every day, and it's a shape that someone in Polynesia has never seen before in their life.
Yeah.
Like obviously one of them has an advantage that's nothing to do with the IQ.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think at this point we can consider this debunked. But uh, you brought up a great point about means about scientists and their responsibility.
Hmm.
So we've seen a trend uh, of people, race realists, taking papers and figures from papers devoid of context and using them to further their own ideals. And so things like uh, there's and if I remember to, we'll put it up on the screen because a picture's worth a thousand words. But graphs where you can like see, okay, here's all the Africans, and here's all the Americans, and here's all the Europeans, and look, and they're different colors, and so
Yeah.
there's like clear lines, right? And so uh, I thought you might want to opine a bit on the role that a scientist, the responsibility that a scientist has when they're putting out information like this.
Yeah, so this is something that has really rocked like my community specific, like the population geneticist specifically, was the Buffalo shooting. And because after the shooting, they discovered that he had this it's like a 160-page manifesto, and within this manifesto there were pictures that had been pasted from scientific studies from population genetics of humans, within this to sort of support his idea. And they were the sorts of things like you're pointing out, where you have these little boxes and they color them differently and then they label them by continent, right? And population geneticists have long been like, well, they just didn't read the paper very well, right? Or like they just didn't understand it. And it's like, at some point you have to take responsibility for your actions, because population geneticists have never there's no population geneticist popularizer in science, right? Like that person doesn't exist. And
Yeah, he does. He's right here on this show right now.
well, yeah. I, in general, that they don't exist. That for whatever reason, population genetics is just not left many popularizers, to the general public. And so what that has meant is that whenever we use our, it's heavy in math. It's super esoteric, and so people just generally don't know what we're talking about and what we're doing. And so, but a picture, as you said, is worth a thousand words. So when we create these plots, people can like look at them, they intuit what they think they mean, and then they can just run with them. And since we're not taking any responsibility, we're just saying, oh, well, just read the paper and you'll know. And what you have to do is you take all the individual genomes, and then you say, okay, how many quote unquote populations do I think there are? You designate some discrete number, and then you say, okay, algorithm, tell me what's the best way to group these data sets given the number of populations I think exist. And so the way that we've designated those populations is by continent. So there's Europe, there's Africa, right? There's Asia. And then when you have those samples, lo and behold, they group in the discrete way you force them to. The algorithm is agnostic to what the real pattern of variation is. It doesn't know. It can only group it in the way you have told it to. Now, there are other ways that you could display this data without ever giving it a discrete structure. And that way, you're letting the data speak for itself. You're not forcing the data into a discrete form a priori. That's what I mean. And that's the distinction between like a structure plot and showing something on like a principal component analysis, like a PCA, or just plotting geographic distance and genetic distance, like just on a straight XY plane. Just plot it that way and it's continuous, right? But the structure plots are forcing the data to be discrete, even if it's not. Because again, it's an algorithm. It doesn't know if the data is discrete. It's just doing what you're telling it to do.
An example
And
you
to the
used, I think. Sorry, I cut you off. Stomped on you twice. I promise you're gonna get to talk here in a second. An example you used, I think, in your video was like if you had a color
Mhm.
spectrum and you told an algorithm, find me three groups, it could find you three
Sure.
groups, and they look different,
Yeah.
but the actual data is not that way,
Exactly.
right?
And yeah, and it forces all the intermediates, right, that don't quite fit, it will force them into one of those categories because you've said to only give me three categories, right? So it will just squish and flatten the variation in the data into that discrete category.
All right, Grayson, it's your turn. Go.
I want to say, to the credit of Zach and his colleagues, I do think that we are seeing this like change and awareness in these various fields that are so often abused by these race realists. Like, I know that like several associations are bringing this up at conferences. They're putting out statements to try to get through to the public what the science actually shows. Like, I think the American Association of Biological Anthropologists
Mhm.
has put out statements. They focused on this topic in their conferences of like, hey, like, or the like American Society of Human Genetics has also put out their own statement about race realism and why the science is not supported. And they, at these scientific conferences, there's kind of been at least a little bit more focus in recent years on this topic because it has become a little bit more prevalent with like the rise of like this atomization of the internet and these subgroups that are spreading around these scientific publishings to try to make this point to fit their narrative. And I've seen some of this, but like you'll be talking with somebody that tries to say that race is real, and then they'll show some genetic study, and they'll say, "Well, look, between African Americans and like European Americans, this gene is found at different rate, and this gene is correlated with violent crime. Therefore, and they try to draw all these conclusions that were never actually in the paper, but they think that they're reading between the lines and that the data is supporting their narrative that is never explicitly stated because they can just take some graph or take some sentence out of context and try to make it fit with something that the researchers never intended. And I think that there is a trend of researchers becoming more aware of the fact that, you know, sometimes their work is not just being read by other colleagues. Like an anthropologist might be writing their paper for other anthropologists, or a geneticist might be writing their paper for other geneticists, like for the field as a whole. But I think that there is an increasing amount of awareness that there are going to be lay people that are going to be reading these papers as well. And you need to be clear and sort of, forerun certain misunderstandings that could crop up if you're using ambiguous language or figures that can lead to erroneous conclusions that the data just isn't showing. So I think that there is this awareness, and we are seeing that like the field slowly get better at this, to give some hope to end on,
Yeah,
maybe.
well, yeah, I want to second that in that um, we as a field don't think people read our papers, right? I mean, scientists, especially population geneticists, don't think the general public are reading our papers. And so it came as quite a surprise when you start seeing your figures in the manifesto of terrorists, right? And you're like, whoa, like not only are people reading them, but they're the wrong people are reading them and they're taking lessons that we didn't expect. And so that's what I mean by saying that there's been kind of a reckoning in the field, and that, like people are, thanks to the internet, like these papers are very often published open access now, so anyone can access them and read them and get their own ideas from them. And so in last summer, I go to the evolution conference every summer, and we had a whole symposium on talking about the history of eugenics and race realism within our own field and the way in which we can combat it. And I've been to many evolution conferences over the years, and this was the first one that had like a specific section for it, because it's become such an important topic that we are really trying to grapple with. Because again, I firmly believe that a lot of this is on us for like the realism part, the biological part is on us for not better getting this information across to the public. We've known that race is not real for 40 years at this point. And so it's embarrassing that our work is being used in this way. And to me, it's a reflection on us of not doing a better job of getting across what our results actually mean.
Yeah, it's I think something important to keep in mind, which I mean, you're addressing the problem, and it's the same. You'd address the problem the same way either way. But we can't pretend like this is purely just well-meaning people who don't know any better, who are then going like digging through these papers and finding the things. Like I guarantee you, most of these people did not read plus one looking for like what they saw the figure on their racist screed du
Yeah.
jour, and that's where they got it from,
Yeah.
right? The people who are that there is at least a faction of people who are motivated, are intentional about
Mm.
their efforts to find anything and everything, even if it's misinterpreted intentionally,
Yeah.
um, to support their ideology. And so that just means that you have to be even more careful, because you can't just look at it as like, well, what would a reasonable person think? You have to look at it and say, what would a person who is desperate to find
Mhm.
anything to support their fascist ideology
Right.
think? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to speak to that real quick. I think the internet has enabled a lot of this. Like, speaking as someone who has been banned from more than one racist Discord, like I literally have seen this where, like, I'll find a Discord where they're just obsessively talking about race realism and race science, and they're sharing these figures and they're
Mhm.
trying to find these studies, and one person will share it with 20 and they'll tell them what the conclusion is, or they'll tell them
mhm.
how to interpret the data, and then it just spreads this misinformation in these increasingly segmented off corners of the internet that have not seen light in years.
But it even leaves those dark corners, which is where we have the opportunity to influence them. Like, for example, I'm an atheist, and a person that I years ago had at least a vaguely positive impression of was Sam Harris. And Sam Harris was in the relatively recent past was like, "Hey guys, yeah, God's not real and all this stuff." And oh, also, by the way, real quick, did you know that black people are stupid? Cool. Like,
Yeah.
so like it's we have to be willing to speak to our own tribe, so to speak, because
Mhm.
like
Can
you're
I
not
can
gonna
I
be able
share
to.
my pet theory on? I have a theory, and I think it explains Sam Harris, and it explains all the racists that I have encountered in my life so far. So I want to share my little pet theory about what's driving this reality science denying racism. Like, I think a lot of racism is just like learned from parents or culture or how you brought up, but then at a certain point, it confronts reality, right? Kids go off to college, or they move to an environment where they're confronted with people of different cultures, and then suddenly their empathy kicks in, or their ability to understand people, and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, we're not all that different. And then a lot of these racist notions that they might have been brought up with are discarded because they don't match with the reality that they're experiencing. But with certain people, this doesn't happen. When they're confronted with reality, they tend to like dig in, or when they're confronted with data, they'll come up with some sort of narrative reason about why that data has to be tainted, why it's some woke narrative that's slipping into the data and it's being manipulated because the scientists don't want us to know the truth, or they concoct some sort of reason. And for these people, I think I have identified a common denominator that applies to all the ones that I've met, and that is narcissism. I really think that a lot of these race realists are narcissists, and they think so highly of themselves that they identify themselves within this certain in group, and so that their own narcissistic tendencies tend to reflect on their in group as a whole, and it kind of fuels this. And when you're confronting a narcissist with some sort of reality that conflicts with their grandiose sense of themselves, they will oftentimes do this same kind of mental gymnastics to try to explain it away, in a way that they can preserve their own egos. And I think, this applies to very rich and successful people that are racist, and very poor people that feel very jaded or bitter about their social standing. And I think that narcissism is the tie between these things, because they could say, well, look, I have not been successful in life. I am really struggling. I haven't been able to attain my dreams or my goals or whatever. But because they have this narcissistic sense of themselves, they need something to cling on to in order to feel superior to others. And that just happens to be their race. Their identity as their race kind of, their self identity conflicts with their group identity. And I think that narcissism is fueling a lot of this. Let me know what you guys think, because this is This is something I don't know if it's backed by data. This is just my own hypothesis.
I can see the correlation there because I've experienced narcissists in my own life, and they are very quick to reject your reality and substitute it with their own. But I don't want to lean too heavily on something like that because I think you run the risk if you attribute it to some kind of cause like that of um, othering them in the way that, like, oh, it couldn't be me. I'm not a narcissist, right?
Mm.
You know, I would never be like that, and I'm not saying any of us would necessarily be like that. But I think that the tribalistic nature of humans is within all of us to a certain degree, right? And that sort of tribalism and wanting to feel superior, wanting to have an explanation for why things are going poorly, wanting to be able to group all of these other people into discrete boxes that are then easy to understand, and just a good old fashioned lack of empathy. But
Which is also correlated with
it
narcissism.
is true. So
Narcissism.
I'm not saying you're necessarily wrong, but I think that the problem is it can come from a whole slew of
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
factors. But the
I'm not
cure
saying it's an end all be all. It's definitely multifactorial. It's just something that I have noticed with just about every person I've come across that has been expressing like racist ideas. They also are highly narcissistic. Maybe again, it could be sampling error because I don't think normal people go on Discord to debate race realism. Maybe so. Maybe there's a bias towards narcissists, but who knows? Zach, did you have any thoughts?
I find it's difficult for me because there's narcissists that aren't race realists. There
Yeah, yeah.
are race realists maybe that aren't narcissistic. And there's also this kind of funny coextensive thing in that they're also all white men, right? And so it's like, well,
I think that's a far more predictive
it
factor.
could just be that white men are the problem, right? So I don't know.
So we don't know what the cause is necessarily, but I do know what the cure is, and the cure is more skepticism, baby. If someone tells you that the results of this paper are that if Sam Harris gets on a podcast and says, "Hey, this data over here that I'm not showing you, but trust me, bro, it says that black people are dumber than white people," don't believe him. Go check. Go look at the data for yourself, or even better, because I don't know about you. If I read a paper on biology, I understand the math parts okay usually, but like the whole like what the math is actually telling me I don't understand very well. Even better than that, go to a biologist or someone who's passionate about biology and basically check your sources. Don't believe what this race realist is telling you just because he's telling you. Get a second opinion or maybe a third or a fourth. Ideally, one that's mainstream because they're more likely to be right. So on that, if people do want to learn more about biology, race realism, and other topics, you already introduced your channels, but do it again and let us know like what you got coming up. So we'll start with Zach.
Yeah, my channel is at Talk Pop Gen. I do evolution education, a little bit of pseudoscience debunking, mostly focused on creationism, but occasionally I do race realism as well as sex binary stuff, and a little bit of history and philosophy of science as well mixed in there. The things that I've got coming up, I'm trying to finish up a series that I've been working on for a while. Called The Causes of Evolution, which is looking at sort of the mathematical derivations of all the forces of evolution. I've got one left. And I've got the PowerPoints together. I just need to sit down and record it. And that's going to be gene flow, which I think is a really important force of evolution, one that we often forget about. But we're going to talk a lot about hybridization, horizontal gene transfer, stuff like that, things that are really important for evolution. So that's what I've got coming up.
How about you, Grayson?
Yeah, so my channel again is based theory, as in a well based theory, or the opposite of cringe, like race realism. So, coming up, I've got a debunking video for a recent Jordan Peterson debate where he said a lot of wrong and very scientifically illiterate things about like climate change, medical science, etc. So, going to have fun debunking a lot of those very silly notions that he puts forward. I've also got a video about one of the best evidences for the Big Bang because I also just love science communication and talking about science and cosmology, especially. So I'm going to be going over it's called the power spectrum of the cosmic microwave background. I think it's the very best, strongest evidence for not just the Big Bang, but like dark matter, dark energy, our whole picture of cosmology. So, going to be going into that, trying to keep it short but educational. And then, yeah, I think I've got a debate coming up with a flat earther. I think he's convincible, but he literally has said that if the earth is not flat, then there is no God, as an if then statement. So I don't know how to get past that because, again, you know, where do you go from there? I mean, you're so entrenched in this idea of the earth being flat that literally, if you move that aside, you have to change everything about your fundamental identity. I mean, those are some high stakes.
That is, but as a ray of hope, I was a young Earth creationist, and what led me out of young Earth creationism was science and better science understanding. So I wasn't a flat earther, but I think that they're pretty comparable, and it also,
Yeah.
changed my whole worldview. So maybe this guy's hopeless, but there's a chance. Tony, there's a chance.
Yeah.
For this channel coming up, depending on when this releases, I'm not sure the order, but I believe coming up in the near future, we're going to be talking to Jeff Swearing, I think it's a month or so, about cosmology. And he is a Christian cosmologist, so we'll be talking about the origin of the universe. So there's a lot of that going around. We'll be talking about it from a Christian worldview, like how he interprets it as a Christian versus how I interpret it as an atheist, the evidence to have a good conversation. And I'm sure we'll do more Stratoturn stuff since that's just my life now. But thanks for coming on, guys. I really had a good time. Definitely go check out these fine gentlemen's channel. Links in the description. But till next time, remember, you've always got reason to doubt.